Hi everyone, and welcome to this session on the Advice Gap 2024. I am here with Mike and Steve. Hello, Mike and Steve. And they're going to kind of walk us through the findings from our latest report, which launched last week. So I haven't done any of these kind of crowdcast sessions for a while, so it's really nice to see loads of you here with us this morning. I can see we've got quite a few in already and lots more to kind of come. So I'll kind of give people a little bit of time just to kind of come in. So the background to Advice Gap then. So this is something that started with Citizens Advice back in 2015, and we've kind of been involved in repeating and updating the research ever since then, really. So Mike and Steve are going to kind of do the honours, and they're going to walk us through the three key themes that we found from this year's research. So they're going to talk about impact of consumer duty and what that's doing to the advice gap. They're going to talk about sort of whose problem is this really, actually, whose responsibility is it to solve the advice gap. And we're going to sort of, as you would expect, talk about the advice guidance boundary review and what consumers and advice professionals make of it. So that's pretty much it from me. Everybody's engaging in the chat, which is really lovely. We're very keen for you to get involved, share comments, thoughts, questions, all of that good stuff. How we're going to structure it is Steve and Mike are going to do the talking bit, and you're welcome to kind of keep populating the chat, and then I'll pop back up towards the end and just try and take as many questions as we can. But in the meantime, I'll pass to you, Mike, and you can just direct me when you need me to move on the slides.
Directions. Good morning. Next slide, please, Nat. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for spending some time with us to take us through. No, we're going to take you through the advice gap research. That's how this works. As Natalie said, this is quite a big project for us. There's a lot which goes into the research. There's a lot of work goes into it. If you've had a look at the paper already, then you'll see that it's about 88 pages. So yeah, quite a lot to cover through it. You'll be pleased to know we're not going to go through that each an individual page one by one. But Nat, if you can move on to the next slide, we'll start to kind of move into, I guess, some of the key themes. Next slide as well, please. As was mentioned, this is now the sixth time that we've been involved in this research. Second time in kind of full LANCAT glory, and full LANCAT glory for this study means that we're incorporating not only some YouGov work but also the advisor panel. I know there's loads from the advisor panel on the research today, and yeah, thanks for everybody who took the time to complete the survey. I think it's fair to say that this is one of the kind of the most in-depth responses we've ever had from our advisor panel. Particularly at the end of the survey, we asked kind of the usual open question: "Is there anything you would like to say which we haven't asked you already?" And we got something like 8,000 words in response around that, and it was very much quality as well as quantity of responses. So it's clear that the advice gap and everything that goes around that is something that the advice profession are really quite passionate about and quite interested in it, and potentially interested in what role they might play to be able to solve it. We also combined the advice research with a couple of bits of research through YouGov. The usual kind of representative sample of the population was carried out there. Consumer research and indeed advisor research doesn't come without a cost. So thanks very much to the sponsors who made this happen, in particular Quilter and Royal London as headline sponsors. Yeah, it wouldn't happen without their involvement around this. So we're really grateful for them enabling us to get on and doing it. So if we can get to the next slide, we'll just do a little bit of background very, very quickly, just to kind of set the scene around what's happening in the advice sector. So this is a chart which I'm sure some of you have seen before. One of my favourite days of the year is going to happen fairly soon, where the FCA updates their annual reporting around what's happening in the advice sector. So I get that colour in my charts and pretend I know, Steve, how I know how spreadsheets work and Excel works and all the rest of it. But there's a huge amount of data which the FCA provide around the intermediary sector and what's going on. I just wanted to kind of just draw out a few things around this. So on the left-hand side, you can see it's a very stable market in terms of the number of firms and the number of advisor staff in the sector, and also stable in terms of the structure on the bottom left there, the size of the advice firms. Very, very dominated by very small firms. So the gold and orange there are firms who have less than five advisors or one advisor in the business. So yeah, half of the sector are one person bands. 90% of the sector have less than five advisors. And that's quite relevant for this when we talk about kind of the potential role that the advice profession has or doesn't have in addressing the advice gap. A lot of those businesses are pretty small, so they're not going to necessarily have the capital to invest in developing new services, new products, technology, etc., etc. And also for a lot of those businesses, they're busy already. They're lifestyle businesses. So actually, the thought of taking on more clients and more clients who are perhaps less profitable than their core clients would frankly be insane for a lot of those businesses. Top right, you see the revenue chart, and that's doing what revenue chart should be doing. So going up towards the top right of the chart there, revenue's growing quite healthily through since kind of 2016 and pension freedoms, a little bit of a bump for the pandemic in 2020, but recovering quite significantly off the back of that, thankfully. But also quite a big shift towards ongoing revenue. The gold there is ongoing revenue when you break down the revenue split that the sector's enjoying. If you took that further back, uh, if anyone wants me to show them my spreadsheets, yeah, give me a DM. I'll quite happily take you back to 2012, 2013. The revenue split then was about 50-50 between initial fees and ongoing fees. It's now about 80-20. So, yes, something like 78% on average in the advice sector, their fees are generated by ongoing revenue. And again, relevant for the topic in hand, because when we think about kind of the what that means for kind of the activity. A lot of these firms are more focused on serving existing clients rather than necessarily attracting new clients. And finally, on the profits on the bottom part around that, I've stripped out the kind of the bigger firms, the firms with over 50 advisors, because there's always some vertical integrations, fun and games going on around that. But you can see the profits within the sector, particularly for that 90%, the 2 to 5 advisors, the one man bands, those are generally pretty flat. So yeah, revenue's going up, but it's becoming more and more costly for regulatory costs, FSCS fees, etc., more and more costly to run businesses as well. So if we could jump into the next slide, we'll then start to kind of move away, I guess, a little bit from the background. Natalie, are you awake? Next slide, please. Oh
I
no,
am. They're not moving, but give me a second.
there we go. One final little bit of background, just whilst I get my breath back from that mild panic. One final bit of background. We collect platform data. Whilst I've got my spreadsheet of FCA data, my friend and colleague Rich is equally sad and collects platform data. I think for fun actually, but he's managed to find a job that actually employs him to do it as well. This is an output from Richard's big spreadsheets, and you can see that the platform sector is pretty volatile still in terms of the flows, and particularly if we're starting to look at the net flows, the net position obviously in the black line towards the bottom there, had a little bit of a uptick in the last quarter, but recently there's not a huge amount of money going onto the platforms, or certainly when by the time you account for outflows. Lots of reasons around that. Again, the dominance in ongoing servicing fees, I think, for the advice sector, cost of living crisis, bank of mum and dads, etc., etc. But whilst the platform sector isn't a direct proxy for what's happening within the advice sector, it does show again this picture that the advice sector is just kind of flatlining a little bit. It's doing well, but the revenues are strong, the profits are still strong, but there isn't a huge amount of growth within that sector that we're necessarily seeing come through. Right, next slide, please, Natalie. hopefully works quickly. Yay, excellent. Right, finally onto the topic at hand, into the advice gap. So, headline figure, which if you saw some of the coverage we did last week, this was obviously the figure which we knew was going to get picked up by a lot of the press, and I think a lot of the coverage was centered around this. So the advice gap, when we ask the consumers through YouGov, have you paid for advice in the last 2 years? That figure has now fallen from 11% on last year's study down to 9%. Lots of reasons behind that, I think, which we'll dive into. But yeah, a noticeable decline in the direction in the wrong direction, I guess. Worth noting that this definition of paying for advice is stretches from kind of paying for mortgage advice, protection advice, into full-on financial planning, which is kind of where most of our advice panel operates. We've previously attempted to ask kind of consumers the differences between that, and it becomes very messy because a lot of consumers can't necessarily tell what's going on. But this is the definition which the CAB started with back in 2015, and it's fluctuated around kind of this 11 to 9% mark ever since, really. But this is the first decline we've had outside of the pandemic for about 3 or 4 studies. So if we could go on to the next slide, we'll start to look at some of the drivers around this. So Steve's favourite spreadsheets, which he completes, which are, let's face it, much more in depth than my ones, are around the State of the Advisor Nation survey, which is another big wave study which we do. We're on the sixth. Really should know these things.
You should, yeah, you should.
Yeah.
So the last iteration, the work conducted in October, November last year was the sixth wave
Okay.
of State of the Advice Nation.
Yeah.
On you go,
There we go.
Mike.
Thanks for asking. So the sixth version of State of the Advisor Nation, which is tremendous, we usually participate all the time, etc., etc. One of the many questions which we asked within that study was around consumer duty, and then trying to kind of get underneath the impacts of consumer duty in advice firms back in October last year. You can see the results on the screen here. So we asked kind of the questions, what has changed? None of those at the bottom. So 1 in 5 firms were saying that they hadn't changed anything around consumer duty. But yeah, the majority had made some changes as a result around that. Client segmentation towards the top there, communication of the client with clients at the very top, charging us off in the completing the top 3 as well. But we also kind of aggregated various results and also an open-ended question, kind of what's gone on as a result of consumer duty. And even back in October, our advisor panel were saying that the kind of the net effect around all of this is firstly an improvement in client experiences, but also a widening of the advice gap. So we can jump on to the next slide. We'll then start to kind of look at some of the research which we conducted about a month or so ago in April, May this year for the study. So obviously, I think kind of 6 months on from State of the Advisor Nation, and a little bit further, more of a chance for consumer duty to embed itself within the advice sector. So firstly, asking here, so as to what extent has it made it easier or harder to service clients with a low amount of investable assets? And we deliberately didn't define what a low amount is. That will vary from firm to firm. But you can see there about 80% or so of respondents saying, yeah, 4 or 5, it has made it considerably harder to do so. Next slide, we'll then start to look at the impact around all of that. So yeah, actually, it's made it harder. So what have you actually done off the back of that? And what you can see here, again, kind of focusing on the none initially, over half of firms in our most recent survey are saying that they have already stopped serving clients as a result of consumer duty. Quote here from the advisor panel. I mentioned the responses we had from our advisor panel, the kind of the verbatims were really quite extensive and really quite useful. So there's a huge amount of those. We deliberately kind of extended the length of the paper to include as much of the advisor views as possible. But this feeling that comes from a decent majority of the advisors we speak with, that actually just the cost is getting higher and higher. And whilst consumer duty might be well thought, and I think most advisors are on board with the principles around consumer duty, it's just another kind of additional cost for firms and their clients ultimately to be absorbing. We can jump on to the next slide. We then kind of, again, sticking with this similar question, kind of, but looking at it from different angles, starting to compare results now from previous studies. What do you do if somebody with a very low amount, 20k, would approach you? And you can see here we've got a little bit more kind of, I guess, clarity around, 20%, 1 in 5 say we're going to turn them away. About half will only serve under very strict conditions. That tends to be perhaps the client's part of the wider family unit, or a very, very high earner at the moment, but is about to become very rich down the line. And there are some firms who have a specific proposition or service in place around that, but that's actually fallen in the last years or so. I think we've seen over recent years, and stretching back beyond just 2023, a number of advice firms trying to kind of do something along these lines, creating a specific proposition for lower value clients, but those tend to fall away in a lot of cases, and they'll revert back to just spending their time serving their core clients. Next slide, please. Just wanted to kind of end this, going back and forth. Here we go. Just wanted to kind of end this section on a bit of a positive. I mean, firstly, a bit of a positive, I think, around consumer duty. We've seen kind of we've deliberately focused in on the impact around the advice gap, but I mentioned advisors we speak with tend to be pretty on board around consumer duty. I think they'd like to see the regulator probably enforce certain aspects of it a little bit more, particularly perhaps the kind of the provider service elements around that. That tends to be kind of a common score, which we hear from a lot of advisors, that things still, haven't seen any improvement in service over the last 12 to 18 months. But when we also ask around consumers, have you seen any kind of benefit in change in the last 2 or 3 years? Clearly, we're not going asking a consumer research about consumer duty. As I well know, when you speak to real people about regulation, they tend to walk away. But when we ask consumers repeatedly throughout our study, how helpful was your experience of paid advice? You can see that this has been, again, moving in the right direction. So a noticeable increase from kind of 2022 and beyond, up to 90%, 91% of respondents now on the consumer research are saying, yes, we paid for advice, and yes, we found it helpful. It was a good experience for us. We've done separate work in the past, which I'm hoping we're going to repeat again with Royal London, kind of analysing that from a fair value perspective and what consumers actually value, as well as do they think it was actually helpful, because they're obviously slightly different things. But I just wanted to make sure this one is kind of highlighted. There is as I said, we had the kind of if you like, the batch to regulate a bit, and the advice gap is widening, and consumer duty, certainly through our advisor research, does appear to be in the crosshairs around that. But consumer duty was also about improving trust within the sector and improving outcomes for customers, and our research indicates that that's being achieved as well. Really important to keep in mind, I think, with the regulators' focus on ongoing fees in particular, that the vast majority of consumers who are paying for advice are happy with the experience and are happy that they're doing so. So if we can jump on to the next slide, Steve is chomping at the bit to do his thing, so I shall pass up north.
Thanks, mate. Chomping at the bit. That's what people say about me. So theme 2, consumers and the advice profession agree that addressing the advice gap is multifaceted, right? What does that word soup mean? Natalie, if we could go on to... Oh, it's not worked, does it? Never mind, I can talk through this. By the way, in case you're sat there at home or in the office thinking this is quite inelegant, you've got 2 blokes, 2 daft idiots, getting Natalie to go next slide. We tried. and at 1 minute to 10, which was fun for all of us when you've got a couple hundred people waiting on a webinar, simply would not allow either Mike or I to upload the slides. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether that was inadequacy or user error or software error, but we are where we are. We're interested.
Hardware. I've just ordered a new laptop. That's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, one of those that work in Isle of Wight. Right, so what does the advice profession think, first of all? So whose responsibility is it to close the advice gap? Very funny, Rob Reed. Hiya. So first of all, the chart that you see in front of you is the view of the advice profession first, right? And it's might be quite difficult to see on the screen. It's full of red. Not the only red slide you'll have seen in the past week, which is a very bad politics joke, but we asked the advice professionals who took part to force rank in order of priority who you think it is that is responsible in closing access to advice in the UK. First, by a very narrow margin, actually, in the grand scheme of things, we've got regulation. We've got a net of just under 60% having regulation as either number one or number two in the order of priority. Next up, we've got government, slightly over 60%, but in second place because there's a smaller proportion who've rated that as the number one choice. Next up, we've got personal responsibility. So a belief that it's I don't know, would you call it a societal issue, an educational issue, not enough financial education in schools or at home, or enough responsibility being taken among individuals to make use of information, free information, educate themselves on what's going on. I'm just going to pause for a second and ask the chat to have a guess when we get onto the consumer side of things, because we asked the same question of consumers, what you think the number one and number two were in the consumer research as I talk. And there's a wee bit of delay in chat coming through. So we'll wait and see for a couple of those responses coming through. Number four, technology. I think it seems to me, I don't know, Mike, you might agree, people in chat might agree, there's certain things that just become the zeitgeist in financial services. A wee while ago it was ESG, blockchain and distributed ledger technology a wee while ago. Right now AI is all over the place, right? And there's lots of people telling you that AI will come along and save the world and cure the world. So it's quite interesting to see technology down at number four, as opposed to in the top one or two. God, the responses are now flying in on the chat. Adrian Nash, Alistair McQueen, both saying government first and advisor second. You're pretty close, actually, and it's worth saying that for the consumer research, what we didn't do is get consumers to force rank everything. We worked in partnership with YouGov to figure out the best way to ask consumers this question, and we actually got consumers to select all that applied. So which of the following do you feel is responsible to help close the advice gap? Of the 2,000 or so who took part in the research, we got something like 3,800 responses. So what that's telling us is that the majority of consumers think it is multifaceted. There's more than one agent responsible for closing the gap. Number one was government, interestingly enough. Natalie's gone on to the next slide already. Thanks, Nat. Bless you. Sorry, this is an impossible job for you, and I'm very, very sorry. Government was number one. Personal responsibility, I think, was number two, and advice profession number three. But you don't need to be sorry to me, Nat. It's my fault, probably. So, what does that say to me? Well, number one, it's interesting that both the advice profession and consumers push technology further down than we might expect, or certainly going into this research, I expected that to be further up on the list. Both pointing towards it being a wider issue than themselves or the sector or products or services or indeed the advice profession. What we're seeing here coming through thematically is that it's for the majority, right? And everyone's different and there's a wide range of responses, but it's this notion of wider governance, societal frameworks and all that kind of stuff that is responsible primarily for closing the gap. Any other thoughts, Mike, as I'm rambling on?
Yeah, I think the technology one, it's more. I think certainly for advisors, the technology is there, it's available. There's loads of great stuff there. It's more a question of the ability to implement it, the desire to implement it, and the line which we talk about a lot, where if you had capital to invest in a typical advice business, what's the best return on that investment likely to be? And using technology to go after clients with just 20K to invest is probably fairly low down around that list. Making the business more efficient, sorting out the back office system, that type of thing is, yeah, it's going to give you a better return on that capital, but that capital doesn't necessarily exist in the vast majority of small firms.
Let's poke a little bit of that. Thanks for that, Mike. So let's poke a little bit of that kind of combination of technology and adoption of technology and the role of it within the advice profession. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm only going to spend 20 or 30 seconds on these next couple of slides, just really back to very, very basic stuff. And we asked the advice profession to two things. So A, what is the typical age of a new client? I think the slides have frozen again. This is going really well, I think, slide-wise. I think slides are well up there. Thanks again, and I'm very sorry again. So if you look at the fringes where that pie chart meets at the top right, you've got 5% saying, and notwithstanding the fact that these are mean averages and distribution curves all over the place, right? But it's a good indicator of where the center of gravity of the advice sector is in terms of deploying advice, right? So you've got 5% saying the mean average client age of a typical new client is under 50, and you've got 6% saying it's 70 or over. The bulk, right, the vast majority, we know this going into this, is that 50 to 65, 66, 67. And if you look, going back to Rich and his spreadsheets, looking at the platform sector, we know that the mean and mode average client age in the platform sector is around the 57, 58 mark, right? Where we've got to as a sector, by and large, and there's always exceptions, and I always feel awkward talking about generalizations, right? Because everybody's different. Is that the center of gravity and the kind of the where the money is in platforms and in financial advice is that post retirement stage, right? We know this, and we know this, but this has huge implications for the wider societal stuff when we look at our research. We also asked about portfolio size. So if we go on to the next slide, we asked what is the typical portfolio size of a new client. There we are. So you see the kind of, God, how would I describe those colors? Careful, Steve. Got the kind of gold, let's call it gold, in 2024 on the left-hand side, and the slightly darker, muddy kind of gold on the right-hand side. At a glance, it's broadly similar, right? There's little bits of quirks inside that data. We see that mean average typical portfolio size moving ever so slightly to the right hand side, so the numbers are getting ever so slightly bigger, but just reinforcing that those chunky portfolio sizes, I'm not going to acknowledge that comment, Aaron, but yeah, very good. It is towards the right hand side of that chart, and everything Mike said a few slides earlier around what would you do if a client with a was it 20K, Mike, approached you, what would you do? And similarly, the question where we ask, has consumer duty made it easier or harder to service clients with low value? We're starting to see that evidence underlined where you just look at the characteristics and the distributions of the book of business. Getting on to potentially my favorite bit in the report, because I don't know, we're all losers, right, when it comes to data, but this is the kind of stuff I like. So if we go on to the next slide, one of my favorite things to do, both in State of the Advice Nation, but also in the individual panel studies and more thematic stuff, is to give thought experiments to those participating in the research to try and tease out like hopes and aspirations and where the sector might go and all that kind of stuff that makes research really interesting for us. So this is where, if you look at the gold, let's just go with gold bar charts, we asked you what is the ideal, based on your current state of play, right? Based on the providers you use, the technology you deploy, the current structure of your organization, what is the maximum number of clients that can be served per advisor, right? So everything we've learned about how the advice profession has evolved in the last 10, 15 years or so, again, like the laws of mass generalizations apply here, right? But everything around the evolution of a more consultative approach, the um, more behavioral finance, financial well-being, humans under management, all that kind of stuff, which has really underpinned a more human-to-human consultative approach to financial advice. Well, bringing that back to first principles, what that says to me is there has to be a ceiling, right? There has to be a maximum number of clients that any one advisor can service in any given year. So we asked that of the participants of the study, and here you see this, the numbers settle at around, again, mean averages and all the flaws of mean averages, but the numbers settle at around 110, 120, 125 mark, with a few on the fringes on the distribution curves on either side. Lovely little quirk coming through the data where you've got the owners of businesses thinking that more work can be done than the people at the coalface. So the people delivering advice and planning, and both Mike and I work for Mark Paulson, and he's forever telling us we should do more work. I know that's certainly true of Mike. I know I'm working to capacity all the time. The black line chart that you see that's overlaid on the secondary axis is where we get the thought experiment to really kick in. And it's where we say, if everything worked in a nirvana state, right? So if the technology worked as it should, if the processes worked, if you weren't held up by integration issues, letter of authority issues, etc., 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 what capacity could you unlock? And here you see on the secondary axis on the right-hand side, you've got the numbers floating at around the 40 to 50% mark. So you've got the profession telling us that if technology worked better, if providers work better, if integration, letter of authority, service standards, all that kind of stuff work better, there is capacity to unlock anything up to 40 or 50%. Can we get there? Maybe. Can we get there anywhere soon? Probably not. I'm from Fife, so I'm a natural skeptic. But yeah, really interesting to see that the profession believes that there is additional capacity to unlock. Really fair comment from Rob Reed. Don't we need to split virtual hybrid and face to face? Absolutely. Totally agree with you, and perhaps we'll take a poke at this somewhere down the line. You're also consistently telling me that our surveys are too long, so we've worked hard to make them as swift and as smooth as possible for those taking part. But I take your point, Rob, mate. We will look to incorporate that in future studies. So yeah, in summary, the profession believes there's capacity to unlock, but the profession believes that there's wider structural issues at play around governance, around society, around financial education. Moving on to theme 3.
Thanks, Steve. If we can jump into next slide, which we're there already. Right, so we're just going to spend kind of the final 10 minutes or so talking about what the future might hold, and in particular, the future around the advice guidance boundary review. So the discussion paper that was doing the rounds at the start of the year, which is due to turn into a formal consultation, I think in the coming months, and then hopefully at some point in time that will eventually get its way to being a policy statement. So I would imagine at some point next year. So we're reasonably down the regulatory path around this, but there's still quite a lot to go until these rule changes actually happen. And indeed, there will need to be some legislation changes around them. It's not just FCA that are involved in this work. There's governments, whoever they are, will need to get behind this as well. Just wanted to kind of just briefly talk about what we would see in kind of our own humble opinion as kind of the objectives, the success criteria for these particular changes. And these are probably set up in order. Certainly the first one, I think everyone would agree that it's vital that consumers are protected, whatever form of advice, guidance, nudging, whatever it is, there is appropriate consumer protection in place. And I think it's probably fair to say that consumer duty I think does deliver the framework around that. There's a lot of rules, particularly around target clients and fair value, delivering good outcomes, etc., avoiding foreseeable harms. There's a lot of rules there which the regulator could use to enforce if and when needed. Secondly, really vital that the services, anything new that comes into the sector, is a positive impact from a competition point of view. A little bit of concern, I think, as we go perhaps a small danger that the advice sector, the value which they're adding to their clients is going to be diminished by other services coming in at a much lower price point. And then again, the third one, I'm not sure necessarily this is one which the regulator's ever going to solve, but it's this point we keep coming back to. The technology is there, the regulation will get clarified at some point in time, but it's still really quite challenging to make these services commercially viable, and particularly if it's an opportunity cost question. Do you want to spend time serving profitable clients, or do you want to spend time serving less profitable clients? It comes down to that level of kind of simplistic outcome, I think. But this work, I think, can address certainly the first two, and potentially the third one as well. So it's something I think the advice profession needs to get behind. So if we jump onto the next slide, we'll start to kind of look at what people actually think about these potential changes. Firstly, we wanted to ask consumers, get some kind of consumer views around how they see the advice sector, and potentially, as we'll see in a moment, starting to test some of these changes. This is quite difficult to do from a consumer point of view because there's a real astonishing lack of understanding out there. Everyone knows about the issues and challenges that are around financial literacy and so on. And when you're going into kind of the detail around this, trying to explain the difference between an independent financial advisor or restricted, yeah, it's a real challenge from a research point of view. UW are really quite good where they help us kind of word all of this stuff. So we wanted to ask firstly kind of this difference between an independent and a restricted advisor. So asking, yeah, not necessarily just those two words, starting to spell out exactly what those two might actually involve in terms of kind of the level of advice, the range of advice, etc., etc. And you can see actually the appealing side of things. Most people are kind of, yeah, we want to go towards more of an independent, full range advice rather than narrow, more focused. However, if you jump onto the next slide, there's quite a big difference there when we look at that from an age point of view. So actually, if we ask now, yeah, recommendations from a narrow, more focused number of products providers, that starts to become quite appealing for the youth, for the younger generation, but actually the older generation where the advice sector is operating in, yeah, not so much appealing at all. So there is still definitely this place for independent whole of market advice, and actually the clients, the consumers who are being targeted in that space by the advice profession, that's increasingly their profession as their preference as well, and that preference evolves throughout as you get older. Next slide, please. We wanted to then, again, sticking with the consumer research, we wanted to kind of see if there's if we could find out anything interesting really about the differences between the potential services which are coming through, and particularly the new concepts of targeted support and simplified advice. We used a slightly different research approach around all of this as well, partly because this is pretty complex stuff. It's quite complex, I think, for us supposed professionals to get their head around, but incredibly complex for consumers to understand. We use some language with some kind of definitions of these four services, which have already gone through some consumer testing, but frankly, they're still pretty wordy stuff. And particularly when you're trying to kind of set aside the differences between simplified advice and holistic advice and where targeted support sits within that. But what this is showing us really is that they're broadly the same, really. The level of understanding. There's maybe a little bit of difference on the two extremes. So I think people probably do understand the difference between complete self-service D2C operations versus full-on holistic advice. But these were just kind of text definitions. There was no price point within this. There was certainly no mention around FOS and FSDF protections and all of that type of stuff within that, because we knew that would blow consumers' minds. But these services, they're going to be quite challenging, I think, to communicate in a way which gives kind of clarity about the differences between the services that are there, but also doesn't force people down the path of making comparisons purely on price. And if we could go on to the next slide, this was some research which coincidentally was published by Scottish Widows a couple of weeks ago. Obviously not part of the research we were conducting, but I just wanted to bring this in to kind of emphasize this price point. So it's obviously a different study, different methodology, etc. But the guys and girls of Widows were asking this particular question around price to their consumer audience before. Incidentally, this is we've deliberately stopped asking consumers through our study how much would you pay for financial advice, as all it serves to prove is if they don't know the answer to what a financial advisor would be charging, it tends to come out at kind of 250 quid for a financial plan or something like that. But when you set these options aside and cost attributed to it, because of that confusion, I think there's a lack of clarity around what these different services, what's the differences between simplified advice and holistic advice. People naturally start to use price to make their selection and naturally want to go for the cheaper option. Huge preference to go for option 2 here at a cost of 0 to 50 quid, 10 times cheaper than something which a financial advisor will be charging for a full financial plan. So this is, I think, the thing of the tail that the advice sector just needs to be careful about, making sure that the value which they are adding to clients and the satisfaction that clients are getting through advice fees, that's highlighted, and there's sufficient clarity that there is a world of difference between Scottish Widows walking you through your pension options versus sitting down with a financial planner who's going to look after you and your family on a holistic, ongoing basis. If you jump to the next slide, please, Nat. So starting to kind of then move away from the consumer research, wanted to ask advisors what do they think about some of these proposals. 33% I think have fessed up that they've not read the current discussion paper, which, as I said, it's a discussion paper, so at this stage that's probably fair enough. Advisors have better things to be doing sometimes than getting into the early stages of regulation. But I would, as this evolves, I think on the next stage into a formal consultation and towards final policy, I think that's the time to start to pour yourself a stiff drink and sit down and read the papers, or better, obviously, subscribe to our analyzer service and let us do the hard miles for you and read our interpretation of it. But within the ones who have responded to it, 14% say yes, actually, we're probably going to do something off the back of that. But the majority, 34%, we're not. It's not for us. We can see other firms successfully implementing simplified advice, making some changes. But we're going to carry on doing our own thing. I think that's kind of the vibe we're getting from this, that the advice profession is pretty on board with the changes. They don't really see it as a threat, but they're perhaps less likely to actually do anything off the back of that. They're going to wait for somebody else to make the changes. And we can jump onto the next slide. We'll look at firstly the scope around this, and then into who is going to make the changes. But the current discussion paper has kind of ring-fenced outside of the scope pension accumulation decisions. But there's been a lot of chat, certainly within the sector, and the FCA have talked about this publicly more recently. That the consultation has raised a lot of responses saying actually pension accumulations should be in scope going forward. And I suspect that that's going to change when we get the next output from the regulator. So I wanted to ask the advice profession what they feel about that. There's a little bit of kind of disagreement around that. So 15% saying actually disagree, simplified advice shouldn't necessarily go on around that. but actually, yeah, strongly agreeing, yeah, these decisions are too complex. Yeah, there's a bit of a kind of polarized view around that. Some are happy to have the scope expanded, some are not. And then if you say right, okay, if it is expanded, do you think it would have a negative impact on your advice services? Bearing in mind the proof points Steve had of this is where advisors are focused in terms of age, demographic, and and wealth as well. Then yeah, 15, almost 15% saying yeah, there's a danger it would reduce the value in consumers' minds of financial planning. But actually, double that, a majority are disagreeing. They're two distinct and separate things, and they're confident displaying their own value. So we can move on to the next slide. Targeted support, similar thing really. So this will be kind of providers. One of our sponsors, Jamie Jenkins, talked about this really quite eloquently at our session last week, where the world where a client can phone up a provider and ask lots of questions, and the providers can see the answers to it. They know the answers to it, but they can't tell you, which is deeply unsatisfactory from a customer's point of view. And it's probably perhaps going to certainly increase the risk that the client is going to do kind of the wrong thing. Is going to self harm by doing the wrong thing on a transactional point of view. So providers are able to start to kind of use big data, MI, just to be able to get a little bit more support around that. Yes, some are seeing that as a real positive and actually would start to select with firms who are doing that. The vast majority, no real impact. Clients will interact with the advisor still on the first instance. And yeah, just that small still kind of, it's a bit of a threat, and that nagging doubt that providers are going to steal my clients is still there amongst a small part of the advice profession. Next slide, please. On to the conclusions and Q&A. So just to kind of briefly wrap that up, so I want to give as much kind of at the time we've got left for questions if anyone indeed has them. I think there's a couple of things just to kind of emphasize from my section. Consumer duty, I think, has, as I said, the research does show that the advice gap has widened as a result of the changes that consumer duty has made. Most advice firms I know have now got renewed focus on who their target clients are through the work they had to do on products and services, and ensuring that those services represent fair value. And that has naturally resulted in kind of some clients not necessarily meeting that definition. I almost kind of thinking that process through, I'd be alarmed if this wasn't the case. This is an indication that the sector has got behind consumer duty and is doing exactly what the regulator has required them to do. But it is positive. We are seeing some signs that the other objectives of the primary objectives of consumer duty of improving trust and outcomes is starting to come through as well. For the future regulatory changes, I just think it's something the advice sector needs to get behind, really. There's a chance here, I think, for the value of advice to be highlighted a little bit more than it is at the moment. We didn't get a chance to talk about this on the webinar, but when we ask consumers who are not paying for advice why they're not doing so, it tends to be because they can't actually see the value in the fees which are being charged. So yes, start to kind of improve these services through simplified advice and targeted support, but it's vital that those are communicated in a clear manner, which will increase kind of trust overall in the sector. People will be able to understand the differences between the services, but it will also kind of show the value that the advice profession is increasingly adding to those clients. If that doesn't happen, there's a danger that people will start to use price to compare these services, and the advice sector might come under a little bit of pressure by people saying, well, why are you charging me thousands of pounds for a financial plan when I can go to Scottish Widows and get it for 50 quid? And I think that's more than enough for me. I don't know if you have anything to add on conclusion, Steve.
I've just got two things that come to mind. First, I'm going to buy you a new microphone. Second, so you can hold me to that promise. Second, nothing that I disagree with at all, Mike. Brilliant summary as ever. of the regulatory stuff. One observation for me is looking at the chat, and there's nothing that anyone's raised on the chat that I disagree with actually, and it's all brilliant points. Is that isn't it so hard to get stuck in the weeds of terminology and how excruciatingly difficult it is? And rewinding back to designing the questions Mike made, like you, me, and Kate and others a couple of months ago, how difficult it is to communicate this to consumers. I think it's worth, like, certainly from my perspective, what comes to mind is just go back to first principles. What the data shows us is that if you are receiving advice, face-to-face advice, satisfaction is trending up the way. People are by and large delighted with what the advice profession is offering, and that's great. But when we get to different terminology and the advice guidance boundary and all that kind of stuff, it's just fiercely difficult. Consumers just don't perceive a difference. The stuff in here in the report that we've not brought to life on the screen because we just can't, because there's not enough time, would be here all day. You got 50% of consumers either think guidance and advice is the same or they don't know. So it's half of the population. When Mike brought up that slide around the net appeal of DTC versus targeted versus simplified versus holistic planning, using I forget how you pitch it, Mike, but using the agreed wording that's been tested before and consumer tested, there's no like perceptible difference between the four. So I think we need to try as a sector to not get too hung up on how loaded the language is a lot of the time, and this seems like it just holds us back so much, but get why it does and understand that if you're getting advice, you're probably happy and you're probably doing a good job. And I'm running out of steam, but I had something else to say. Yeah, I'm running out of steam. Let's get on to questions. It was going to be really good, I'm sure. But...
If it comes back to you, we'll give you the floor, Steve. Thanks very much, both of you, and thanks to you at home for bearing with us with your patience with me driving the slides and little technical difficulties and things like that. I'll take a couple of questions in the short time that we've got left. So one of them was around kind of I think I'll take Alistair's actually now, where he talks about the advice guidance boundary review and whether this is actually going to make a difference to advice professionals. Are they judging the outcome of advice guidance boundary review correctly? What do you guys think on that?
Yeah, I think they probably are at this stage. Yeah, I think it goes back to first and kind of a typical advice business. 90% of them are less than 5 advisors. So are they really going to do anything other than focus on their core clients? I think that's the risk to this, which kind of goes beyond just the advice guidance boundary. I think if anything happens to affect kind of that segment of the population, that increasingly narrow segment of the population that the advice sector is serving, if they carry on serving that well and delivering good outcomes, and the 91% are saying that they're happy, and the work we've done on behalf of Royal London also shows that those consumers who are paying advice fees are very comfortable that it's delivering fair value from their perspective. As long as that continues, and I think the advice sector is going to carry on focusing on those clients where the demand is greatest, and in a lot of cases, the demand is outstripping their ability to supply them as well. I very rarely hear an advisor tell me that they're struggling to find new clients. So I think in that context, yeah, why would you spend time in an already busy week to try and service clients who are going to be less profitable?
There's also there's a really interesting point in the data that again we've not been able to say today, and someone alluded to this earlier in the comments, but we tested with consumers who hadn't received advice. Were you to receive advice at some point in your future? How would you like that to be delivered? And technology-driven solutions, so online messaging, Zoom, etc., do trend upwards as you move down the ages, but not as much as you would expect. And indeed, even in the very, very lowest age band of, I think, 18 to 24, those days are long gone for me. But even at the very, very lowest and up the way, it's something like 60% plus would still expect financial advice to be delivered face to face in the live environment. So, yeah, I think for the time being, certainly, Alistair, I think traditional or modern or however you want to phrase it, advice services are safe.
Great, thank you. And Lewis was asking, maybe this is one for you, Steve, but Lewis was asking if we have any appetite for sort of tracking attitudes of young people around all this stuff. Ultimately, they're the sort of future advice clients, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely, Lewis. And we Simony made a great point earlier around can you split the responses by age? We've absolutely got all of that, Lewis. So as these studies mature, we've got trend data upon trend data upon trend data. Absolutely, we want to keep looking at stuff like that. So watch this space for next year if we can get it off the ground for Wave 7.
Cool. And I think I'll make this my last question, but quite a lot of the sort of the thread of the chat has been kind of the role of tech in some of this stuff. So whether that's kind of, I think somebody called it personalized advice for Netflix price, subscription models, that kind of thing. Do you guys think there is scope for tech to solve some of this stuff? Or given your point about people want face-to-face advice, actually the tech helps with the advice process, but maybe it doesn't help with getting advice to more people and actually
Yeah,
increasing demand.
I think it's there. I'm looking at Michael Harden's comment in the chat. I think a lot of firms are already doing that. So I would argue that Hargreaves Lansdown and the likes are already doing that role of helping people accumulate wealth and get to the point of retirement where the needs become much more complex and the holistic advice sector then falls in. If you listen to Hargreaves, kind of some of their strategic stuff, then they are very much talking about, yeah, we lose a lot of clients in their late 50s to the advice sector. So they're developing their own advice services off the back of that. I think the improvements that they will offer will be around the targeted support and the simplified advice services. Those types of organisations will be chomping at the bit for these changes to come through.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much, everyone. Similarly, nobody wants to see us doing the splits, so thanks for putting that image in our minds. All that's kind of left for me to say is if you haven't already, please download the report. We'll put a link into the chat, or you can kind of find it on the Lancat website, lancat.co.uk. Thank you, Jen. Seamless. So thanks ever so much to our sponsors there. The reason that the report is available for free. They are Royal London Quilter, Aberdeen, and Fidelity. Thank you, as always, for getting engaged, for all your questions, for all your comments. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Steve and Mike. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.